over the body, Justin.
Grades.
Grades?
Yeah, it's cool.
Go back to the children one. Go back to. I'll let you get off of that in a minute. Go back to the children one.
I may be wrong, but like let's say you got pregnant because you over-fertilized or whatever, and you have like 5 separate, that would be embryos or
Quintuplets, yeah.
okay, and you
Tuplets.
have to get rid of 2 so that the other 3 could survive and be healthier.
Do we allow that to happen? That may make biological sense.
Your chances for healthier babies, like just to keep 2 or just to keep 1.
Does the law allow that? Hang on, go ahead. You can share. Okay. Anencephalitic children are children who are born with a brain stem and no higher brain. The longest I ever heard one survive is a year. Normally we're at weeks or maybe month and a half. But we can't discard them, not in our culture. In our culture, we offer them, and we'll get to this next week, we call it ordinary care. You have to hydrate, you have to warmth. If feeding is possible, you feed, but there's no chance of survival. Much different than the animal world. However, there are some cultures, and you missed this when we did moral virtue because I was out in Portland, but I would have shared with you that in the Spartan culture, any male child born was automatically examined for one purpose only, and that was to be the greatest soldier that Spartan could provide. And if children were found to be at all physically defective, they were left out to the elements to die. It's called infanticide, and it was perfectly okay. The culture accepted that these children aren't going to make it, so we just leave them to die. Infanticide children will not survive, but our culture says you just can't discard a life like that. We know we're not going to save it, but you have to at least give it what we call comfort care. And that's what he's talking about, culture to culture to culture to culture to culture to culture. If we examine the way we practice morality, we realize that culturally we differentiate at certain levels of value. There are some cultures that are okay with infanticide, there's other cultures that aren't. The Chinese culture, because they were so overpopulated, decided for a while one child only. And for whatever reason, the culture saw that male children were more beneficial than females, and so if you had a female child, they were left aside. Or if you knew beforehand they were aborted, they wanted a male child, even though nature dictates more females than males. Cultural relativism, how they looked at things, the value they placed on human life.
I know we're talking about children here, but one of the most controversial things that I still remember to this day, Terry Schiavo.
Mm-hmm.
And the decision for years of, do we leave this woman in this vegetative state?
The law alleviated that decision.
Finally.
In 1960, 1990, it's called Cruzan versus Missouri Health Services. You can ask to be taken off of life support, but that's one of the cases that provoked that law. Go ahead, hang on.
I was going to say, technically, it's a child for a parent to go and fight for it.
And her husband.
Yeah, and her husband wanted to unfund.
And who had more rights over someone else's human life? We decided the husband did. That's been the way the law has regulated it.
Because it said that the parents saw her as a child, but the husband saw her as an adult.
And the law saw her as a ward of the state. Go ahead.
I feel like we're all born with a fair, or said to have a fair chance at life, but if you're born with because they say we're born with IQs, if you're born with a lower IQ, you're going to have less of a chance in this world against someone with a higher IQ, and that just throws it off right there. It's things that we can't help. We say that it's all fair, but it's really not fair, and it's kind of out of our hands.
I have 2 kids. I'm just going to say that. Yeah, 4. My older son has a hearing issue, so he's almost 2 and he's not saying anything. So, but my younger son is waving, clapping, saying that he's only 7 months old. So, I almost feel like we put more effort into teaching the little one what to speak. And maybe I'm a horrible dad for it, but I almost can see that he's not going to grasp it. So, why put the energy into that? Why not?
And let's out of it, this is where we live. My second boy popped out of the oven, and this side of his head was here, and this side of his jaw was over here. He was born with clap feet, which means they formed in his mother's birth canal. Normally, a turnaround breech at the beginning of month 9, so that you can be born head first, because your head's got 4 plates to it. So when it comes out that little canal, Joey was a mess. Turns out he's got Asperger's syndrome. He's also got a photographic memory. A lot of issues, some of which maybe we wish we had. How many of you have an eidetic memory? Anybody in here? Eidetic memories? That's a photographic memory or near photographic memory. And yet this happens to be packaged in a boy who has cerebral palsy. It's a garbage turn for brain damage. It is, and I'm not being critical, I'm respecting that, because that's what happens. We get the hand that we're dealt, and we have to deal with it. We're not animals. That's why we don't deal with it the way the animal world is. No.
I said on Monday about the hypocrisy thing. We say human life is valuable, but yet they have the choice to, let's say, put them up for adoption because they don't want to raise the child. Okay, well, they had to have the woman had to have the baby, but yet she didn't want it, so she placed up for adoption. But going through, whether they're dumped at let's say, an orphanage, or, lucky go to a foster home or whatever, and then they realize that they have developmental issues, so then nobody wants to adopt them. I mean, it's the same thing when people are adopting children. They look for specific children. So
Some people, to balance that out, that's correct, some people to balance that out know that they're impoverished and cannot raise a child and want to give it a better chance, so they hope there's a family that can raise them and give them the benefits that maybe finances and a more healthy environment would give them. No, you're right. Go ahead.
My boss used to, or my old boss, adopted children that were less fortunate and had a lot of health issues because she had so much money and she didn't know what to do with it, so she would just help them out.
Sure.
And then there's people who, like she said, look for the exact specifics of a child, like the same hair colors, eye color, or skin colors.
So the purpose of showing you this little vignette in the video is that this is all over the board. We have to acknowledge that. Moral certainty, the whole idea of morality, is across the board. It is culturally driven. We're still back to the question, is there any value out there that's absolute that we can expect certainty with? Everybody with me? Yeah? Okay, so let me switch over to Gensler. Again, he's going to be a little difficult because he goes off on some of it. Now, it turns out that Gensler is a moral absolutist. He thinks there are absolute values out there. That's his prerogative. He believes they are. He also is a moral realist, and he realizes that for most of us, values are formed in our cultural situation that we find ourselves in. Okay? He'll go on to say that your values may be grounded in culture, but some of them may in fact be absolute. You just incorporate them because your culture does. Or you may say, well, our values are right and other values are wrong, and because you say that doesn't make it right. But the fact that you disagree with other cultures also doesn't make it wrong. And that was the malaise that this gentleman was trying to show us in the video. How do you decide the certainty of moral reality? So Gensler starts off with this. He says, cultural relativism says that good and bad are relative to culture. What is good is what is socially approved in a given culture. Our moral principles describe social conventions and must be based on norms or values of our society. So he's going to give you that. That doesn't mean there aren't absolute values. He acknowledges that for most societies, while we want the values of the law to be absolute and immovable, there's enough flexibility for us to have to realize that the law is not perfect, and we make adjustments to the law because we weren't right to start with. And so morality then becomes kind of a movable feast. We're still trying to nail it down and get it right. So these are his opinions. And then you'll see highlighted in magenta, it's really dark brown. Those are my counters to it. So I just want to go through hers to start with. Now, as a philosopher, he's going to set up what we call a straw man, or in this case, a strong woman. He's going to pick out a figure, a character, who's going to believe in moral relativism. Meaning he's going to call her I am a relativist. I'm a relativist. I am a relativist. Okay, so that's the straw figure he's going to pick out. Gensler's objection to cultural relativism that does not that it doesn't exist, it does, and he admits that his objections and conclusions rely on both good and bad moral reasoning. I highlight the ones that are his and then my counter arguments. So he starts with, I'm a relativist. She says, I was brought up to believe that morality is an objective fact. When you pop out of the oven, the only thing you know is what you know. You're given truth, and that's the facts. And that's what you believe is right and wrong until you account to the age of what we call rationality, and you can begin to think for yourself and decide if these values you want to own. They were given to you, then there's a matter of ownership. Do you want to own these values or not? Do you want to appropriate them to yourselves? Just as snow is white, and so also infanticide, leaving babies to die from the elements, for example, is wrong. But then I noticed that attitudes vary with time and place. It turns out that the value that I was taught or the values of my society, other societies have different ones. Morality, therefore, is a cultural construct according to Ima. It's hard to argue with that. All cultures construct their own realities, whether it's based on religion, politics, whatever it is, we construct our own realities. And cultural relativism says wrong is a relative term. Let me explain. She says something isn't to the left absolutely or to the right absolutely in this or that society. Similarly, something isn't wrong absolutely but only wrong in this or that society. And she uses the example of infanticide. There are societies out there that allow for it. In fact, they require it. It's just part of their culture. According to Ima, the myth of objectivity says that things can be good or bad absolutely. People who speak of good or bad absolutely are absolutizing their values of their own society. They take the norms or values that they were taught to be objective facts. She goes on to say, on the one hand, cultural relativism gives a basis for a common morality within a culture. So we have agreement. That is a democratic basis that pulls everyone's ideas and ensures that norms have wide support, so I can feel solidarity with my own people even though other groups have different values. Here's the problem with that thinking. Oops. He makes an assumption that in a democratic society we have a pool of information that we work from. So we can have a common agreement. Doesn't mean a universal agreement, we have a common agreement. When the common agreement breaks down, we try and adjust the law to reflect the common agreement. So when we get to next week's lecture, and we'll talk about the traditional sexual morality, there were certain mores, there were certain values that were carried out, and there was no questioning what they were. We didn't show flesh. We were part of the Victorian era. Everybody was dressed from here all the way down to there. And we went through periods of, I don't know if you want to call it revolution or not, and we began to show flesh, like in the Roaring 20s after World War I, and women raised their skirts and we saw flesh, and that really created a firestorm in this country. You could not do that. Then we got into the 60s and we got into a different kind of moral process, and we not only raised skirts from down here, we raised them up here, and then we raised them up here. And now, I don't know, is there a moral dress code? I mean, is it, there's no requirements that well, I'm stuck, but I mean, I don't think you are stuck as, well, the law calls it your clothes, and there's some businesses you have to wear long sleeves if you have tattoos or whatever, you know, and so that's a personal thing. But for the most part, this culture's really decided that mores when it comes to clothing is kind of your choice. I mean, we couldn't go to the city without wearing a shirt and tie. That was the more. Now you just go where you want to go. I mean, who cares, you know? That's nobody else's business but yours.